The things being done on the stage were merely trite and crass, but the undercurrent made them frightening. There was an air about the ponderous inanities spoken which the actors had absorbed like an infection. It was in their smirking faces, in the slyness of their voices, in their untidy gestures. It was an air of inanities uttered as revelations and insolently demanding acceptance as such. An air not of innocent presumption, but of conscious effrontery, as if the author knew the nature of his work and boasted of his power to make it appear sublime in the minds of his audience, and thus destroy the capacity for the sublime within them. The work justified the verdict of its sponsors. It brought laughs, it was amusing, it was an indecent joke, acted out not on the stage but in the audience. It was a pedestal from which a god had been torn, and in his place there stood, not Satan with a sword, but a corner lout sipping a bottle of Coca-Cola. That was Ayn Rand's description of a fictional play titled No Skin Off Your Ass, but it is just as applicable to The 40-Year-Old Virgin by Judd Apatow, which is unfortunately not fictional. This film is a piece of shit. Harsh word, but used with careful consideration. Not only is it zombified lowest common denominator garbage, but it reflects some rather despicable ideas. A major part of what makes this such a dismal experience is that it's aesthetically bland and lifeless, and never exceeds the bare minimum of effort for what a major studio will release. Comedy is no excuse for bad filmmaking. Great comedies, such as those by the Pythons or Mel Brooks, are also great movies on a technical and aesthetic level. They were made with as much care and competence as they would have been if they were serious films, and this enhances the humor because the silliness contrasts with the sincerity of the direction. That is never the case with hack jobs like this. Even though the critics praised this film like mad, proving Ellsworth Toohey still has a job, they never mentioned its technical or aesthetic qualities because there are none to be found. There is nothing imaginative, ambitious, engaging, or entertaining about it. The best entertainment value to be extracted is to look at the Frankenstein and Forbidden Planet posters in the background and wish you were watching one of those wonderful films instead. The writing is even worse, and I use the term writing very loosely because a large percentage of this film was ad-libbed, and my god does it show. And it's not funny ad-libbing like in Whose Line Is It Anyway? No. The humor here is not only dreadful, but every scene goes on for a fucking eternity, which is the surest way to make a bad joke even worse. A good example of how much this sucks as a comedy is the chest waxing scene. It's a dull setup to the world's most obvious punchline, which it proceeds to run into the ground. And of course, Rollo Apatow is so proud of this moment that he calls back to it later in the film, as if it wasn't repetitive enough. It's miserably boring. There are so many pointless moments that at least half the runtime could be cut without losing a goddamn thing. And I saw the unrated version, which exceeds 2 hours. That is ridiculously long for a dumb sophomoric comedy. In general, a comedy shouldn't exceed 2 hours unless it's something very ambitious like The Great Race, rather than this which is devoid of ambition. Now, onto the characters. Steve Carell's character, Andy, the 40-year-old virgin himself, actually has a lot of likable qualities. He is well organized, polite, content to pursue his own interests, and has decorated his residence quite nicely in such a way that reflects his individuality. But we are supposed to view him as a freak and point and laugh at him, not in spite of these virtues, but because of them. His interests do not adhere to the whims of the collective, therefore there must be something wrong with him. There's this really cliched moment where he says something like, "But I do have a good life," at which point it predictably cuts to a montage of him being a loser, supposedly, which really just consists of him doing things he enjoys. And it's not as if he's a drunk or a heroin addict. He collects action figures, rides a bicycle, and plays the euphonium. Oh my goodness, burn the heretic. The primary theme here is that if you do not conform, then you must suppress your own interests and deny yourself, because you only exist to serve the collective. Resistance is futile. And speaking of the collective, the characters who render this film unwatchable are Andy's group of so-called friends. These are complete and utter douchebags. They are second-handed, stupid, obnoxious, irritating, and intrusive. They are a mass of zombified nothings, floating around, doing things which are either pointless or destructive. And by far the worst part is that Apatow doesn't seem to realize how appalling these characters are. In this kind of movie, characters that are deliberately written to be hated inevitably get some kind of comeuppance by the end, or at least have a change of heart. Nothing happens to these fuckers. In fact, it's the protagonist, Andy, who must change his ways, even though he has far more respectable qualities. These are meant to be the normal guys, and if that's the case, then normality should be classified as a mental disorder. Their hypocrisy is another defining characteristic. The one guy is constantly whining about how his ex-girlfriend is a whore, even though he brags about his own promiscuity. They consider Andy to be a man-child when they're constantly behaving like immature schoolboys. They also call him gay because he has a poster for the band Asia. Why? I don't know. Even if he was gay, why the hell should they care? Their homophobia seems to be a psychological projection, seeing as they're the ones who are obsessed with another man's sex life. If the film wasn't stupid, it could have made a good satirical point about these hypocrisies, but that would have alienated its target audience, many of whom are the exact same way. I'm not saying that a movie is automatically bad if it has unlikable characters. In Raging Bull, the protagonist is an awful bastard. But not only does the film understand this, it's built around showing the destructive effects of his irrationality and second-handedness. This is because Scorsese is a genius, whereas Apatow is a moron, or at best, a genius at pandering to morons. The ability to mind one's own goddamn business is an underrated virtue. If you want a good film about how intrusive people suck, watch Rain, where Joan Crawford plays a prostitute who just wants to live her own life but is being intruded upon by this Bible-thumping asshole. Oddly parallel to a film about a virgin who wants to live his own life but is being intruded upon by this group of perverted assholes. Again, there's potential for good satire in this premise, but it's all wasted because it sides with the assholes. In fact, he's allowing them to intrude. The movie wants us to think that he's too reserved, but really his fatal flaw is that he's a pushover and thus an enabler. And he never overcomes this because the movie doesn't realize it's a flaw, even though it nearly gets him killed. I'm not kidding. There's a scene where, under the guidance of the douchebags, he willingly gets into a car with this woman who's drunk driving. But of course, that's just another pointless scene which goes absolutely nowhere and could have been cut. He doesn't learn from his nearly fatal error and continues following their hilariously bad advice. Yet when he inevitably does lose his virginity, it's not at their behest. Therefore, almost everything involving the douchebags could have been excised from the script. Sex and relationships should be voluntary decisions made between sound-minded individuals. This film instead views them as some kind of status symbol or social obligation to appease the collective. This viewpoint is extremely dangerous for obvious reasons. One of the douchebags even advocates going after women who are too drunk to think clearly and explicitly frames it in terms of predator and prey. Yet Andy is the one who gets called a serial killer. The love interest, Trish, is thankfully not irritating and has some motivations that make sense, but is still not a very interesting character, and it isn't believable that these two are sincerely in love. There is no indication that they have a profound understanding of each other, and they have virtually nothing in common. I understand that last point is frequent in romance stories, but when they're better written it becomes apparent that they have more in common than initially assumed. This isn't the case here, and in fact she outright repudiates his interests at some points. There is one moment where Trish's daughter is scorned for being a virgin and Andy stands up for her. That actually could have been somewhat touching if the film had any integrity whatsoever. The film's warped view of sex culminates when Andy's loss of virginity coincides with him selling off his collection, which was the symbol of his nonconformity. This appears to be an act of self-deceit and self-denial, as we're never shown any indication that he has sincerely lost interest in these things. The implication here is that in order to lose one's virginity, let alone get married, one must suppress one's own interests and pretend to be something one is not. This is an extremely bleak and depressing view of human relations, but it's presented as a good thing, which is just reprehensible. Worse, it's objectively incorrect. Charles Ives was an individualist if ever there was, and he was very happily married to his wife Harmony. He didn't suppress his passions for music or insurance, nor did his wife suppress her passion for literature. In fact, they deeply respected each other's interests. Such is the nature of good marriages. The same is true of Stanley and Christiane Kubrick. The marriage in this film, however, will end very quickly. These flaws are not inherent to the type of story that this is. It is certainly possible to write a story about a very introverted character who opens up a bit more without it being pro-conformity. At the end of Frozen, spoiler, Elsa inevitably comes out of isolation, but not at the cost of her individuality or integrity. She still makes the most of her abilities, and the symbols of her independent mind remain intact. And of course she's contrasted with the extrovert Anna, who learns the danger of excessive openness. It remains a very Randian film, and that's part of why I find Frozen so admirable and 40-Year-Old Virgin so contemptible. Although I suppose saying that makes me gay. And by the way, when I complain about the awful messages in this movie, I'm not claiming that it's brainwashing people. On the contrary, it's reflecting bad ideas that already exist among the target audience. Movies like this don't make the public stupid. The public makes these movies stupid. It's the cinematic equivalent of yellow journalism. Gail Wynan said, "Public opinion is what I make it." Charles Foster Kane said, "The people will think what I tell them to think." But they were fooling themselves. Perhaps Mr. Apatow's the same way. I don't know. Though after bashing him for an eternity, I must admit he was co-producer of a good film, The Cable Guy with Jim Carrey. Apparently he also co-directed a TV documentary on George Carlin recently. That's really bizarre because Carlin was a master of using comedy to tear apart popular idiocies, whereas Apatow's work revels in such idiocies. Well, instead of this collectivistic tripe, I recommend watching a good pro-individuality film such as The Fountainhead, Life of Brian, Frozen, or The Man They Could Not Hang. In fact, watch all 4 of these. They're all masterpieces, similar to each other thematically, yet very different in style. But you don't need to take my word for it.
You all got to work it out for yourself!